Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-hosts Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Liz Collin, former Minneapolis reporter and author of the new book, They're Lying, The Media, The Left, and the Death of George Floyd. And we got a bonus. We also have her editor, J.C. Shea, joining us. He has a PhD in strategic media. Think I got that right?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
JC, Liz, welcome to the show.
Thank you guys so much for having us.
It's good to have you. We did not do these in chronological order because based on when we scheduled people, we kind of skipped around. But we mentioned a few weeks ago that we wanted to have people on to talk about different areas of the country and what they're dealing with, you know, in the aftermath of the crazy 2020 summer of love, death of George Floyd and COVID, and kind of, you know, get a local version of that. But then Liz comes along with this wonderful personal story to tie into that and the book. So we wanted to have her on to talk about the media, the left, and the death of George Floyd, because it all ties together. So I guess let's start, Liz, with why you wrote the book. I know you're there locally, so it happened right in your backyard, but you had kind of a personal spin on this story that probably made it a little more intriguing than for others.
Yeah, it all kind of played out in my front yard, to be quite honest.
Literally.
Summer of 2020, but yeah, quite literally. Just to back up a bit, I've been a television reporter anchor for about 20 years now. But back when this happened, I'd been at the current station, the station I grew up watching, the CBS affiliate in town in Minneapolis for 12 years. And I am married to the president of the police union in Minneapolis. He at the time was the president of the union. He has since retired, thank goodness. Due to all of this, quite frankly, like many police officers left as a result. But we saw the angry mob come after him. They directed their anger toward me. Also demanded that I be fired. I was demoted basically the day that this happened and no longer anchored another program at WCCO where I worked so long. But in that time, as this story is playing out, I'm seeing what's happening behind the scenes in the media, and also to see for myself what's happened within the police department. I left in January, that station, and was able to just sort of put this story together with Jay and try to tell the truth in a way that I don't think has been told quite yet when it comes to what happened, because I think we're all paying the price for what happened in Minneapolis that summer.
True. That's definitely true. Will talks about that a lot, and I'm sure he will here because it's the topic at hand. And I want to get into that, but it's important because yours is a little more personal to talk about you and your situation, and then we can spin that to JC and how the media ties into this. Because we were discussing earlier while we were waiting to start, and I was telling you about how I saw this article about you. It's basically just announcing that you left CBS and you found this new role. But the headline says, "Conservative reporter joins Alpha News." And the reason it's struggling, it may not seem odd, you know, conservative liberal, but the reason it's odd is because, keep in mind, people, Liz wasn't, you know, Rachel Maddow. She wasn't, you know, Tucker Carlson on MSNBC or something. She was your local news anchor there. So think back to your towns. And when you watch the news at night and they come on and they tell you what happens locally, how often has anyone ever described any of those people as liberal or conservative? Because I can't think of a time here in New York or in Chicago. They were just the news guy. They were the news anchors, right? We all knew who they were. They do the hard-hitting stuff, the local stories, and then they do some fun stories. They were just people. So the fact that they labeled you conservative all of a sudden, you know, you say you've been doing this 20 years, you were at the station for 14. Had that ever happened before, or is that just something you turned into after George Floyd died?
Yeah, I think like a lot of things, the world sort of turned upside down after that. But no, I mean, you're absolutely right. That was not, I frankly was brought up in the news business that you're not supposed to have a bias. So I didn't really consider myself either way. However, I will say that the newsroom I was working in did definitely lean left. And it's funny you mentioned that headline, Charles. I thought it would have been more appropriate to say that I went to a conservative site after, leaving a left wing media outlet. I thought that would have been more appropriate. They don't ever, they don't ever point.
No. We only label one way.
Just another one of the storylines.
Yeah, no, we can't label them left. We only label people right. Will, before I go to JC to talk about why they're lying, what would you like to start off the conversation with, either about the topic at hand, Minneapolis being ground zero and George Floyd, or just about her situation being drummed out of her role at the anchor desk because of her husband?
Yeah, well, I think we've got a lot of commentators here, so I'm going to have more to say, and that's good. I mean, I'm looking at this panel, but I'm going to have more to say when we get into why they're lying. I think that intro is an interesting one, though, because I mean, I think the George Floyd storyline in general, our RIP to Mr. Floyd, you never want a human being to die, but is one of the most spun stories we've seen recently, where the narrative became this was a racist killing, not just an unfortunate incident. The sole cause of this death was Chauvin's knee, essentially. America's been kneeling on black men's necks for centuries. I mean, I'm trained as a lawyer. I've read the coroner's reports in this case. That's simply not true. I mean, the misreporting of this led to massive racial violence. I mean, you got to a situation where the right and the left in Kenosha months later had a gun battle in the street. I mean, the misreporting of this, especially on the left, and the narrative that was fed to the country is extremely problematic. I mean, Cuba level stuff. So, I mean, that's my comment for right now. I want to hear what Liz has to say, what JC has to say, but yeah, it's not at all surprising. I'll just say this, as someone who's been, I mean, we've all been in the business and media world in pretty big cities. It's not at all surprising that like the Minneapolis lead on this story ended up finding other work, I think. And that's an illustration. And you found similar stuff with like Andy No and Nancy. I mean, the people reporting on Antifa crime in Portland. It's really unfortunate to some extent that if you do a neutral job of reporting on or discussing these stories, I mean, the immediate comment is, you're going to be the given sacrifice. This happens to cops too. You're going to be the person that's labeled hard right so that we can move on with the narrative.
Right. And you make a point. You say that there was a narrative spun, and we'll find out later why by our guest. And then the country just took off and everybody ran with it. And, it hasn't really ended, if you think about it, Shamika, because this was a couple years ago. And we're still debating. I mean, there's a guy, I don't know his name, he's like a kind of famous rapper, a black guy, he raps from Chicago, who kind of got in trouble recently for saying something about the same story. It's like it just reopened. What'd you say?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, if you look at it, his knee wasn't even on his neck like that.
Now you try to get us. Oh God. This is our final episode now. Apparently, if you say that, he wasn't shot 4 times and stabbed to death, you are going to be canceled. But
yeah,
well, it's not really that I'm attacking Kanye for his views. I'm addressing how the wound is so fresh again. So it's like it just happened last week. Everybody's yelling about it. Everybody's saying if you agree with Kanye, you hate black people. It's just this. I mean, why is it such a visceral reaction? It's not like, and this is not mixing it to what they say about black conservatives or the conservatives in general who say, well, why are you talking about this black on black crime? This is not even the only high profile crime, right? It's not like there's others that you can't talk about. It's like, this is the one that everyone will stop what they're doing and debate and basically end you based on your views on it.
If I can say one thing very quickly there, like it's unfortunate as hell that Kanye West said that like he intelligently reviewed the Candace Owens movie. And then the next day he was like, I'm going DEFCON 3 on them damn Hebrews and all this just ignorant. I mean, like, it was just unbelievable. Like I opened up social media to see this brother talking about this. Like I can still work for Adidas, no matter how anti-Semitic I am, they're German. And it was like, oh my God. But the actual comment that George Floyd's knee was more on, or Chauvin's knee was more on George Floyd's back than his neck. That's just straight trial testimony. That's the comment.
And I'm gonna try my best not to get myself in trouble, because whenever I hear blacks and anti-Semitism, my response is probably shocking compared to people who hear me all the time and know what I talk about and see what I am. It's probably shocking, but I feel like I have to say something, but I'm not for now. And hopefully I can make it through the rest of the show without doing so, but it may come out. So JC, what are your thoughts about this? Both how this story is just so larger than life that I think it might trump Emmett Till in the end. I think 50 years from now, we might still be talking about, and then George Floyd, it was a high-tech lynching or whatever they're going to call it. And by then, people will have spun it into all these other things. So they'll be like, his knee was on his neck for 31 hours. And then they, after he died, instead of putting him in the ambulance, they drug him through the streets. It'd be madness. So, we're starting to get to why. So before we get to why the media is lying in general and across the board, why was it arrested judgment? Why didn't they want to wait and do what they normally do? Why was Liz attacked just because of who she was married to? Why did they burn the police station down? Why? What's wrong with it? And I'm not even necessarily talking about how people reacted to it, but how the media seemed to stoke the flames as opposed to being the voice of reason in the story.
Yeah, if I may, and indeed this story is still ongoing. We still have J. Alexander King, who just pled this week, and we still have former Officer Tu Tao, who is now going through his own hearing right now. So this narrative is still being written. I'd like to point out one thing though about Liz's experience, if you will. She actually never said a word about this case or George Floyd on the air, and was still canceled. So never said a word about the case. So that gives you some idea as to what the media was doing.
But you said on air, so some people will hear this say, yeah, because he's leaving out the fact that she went on some big MAGA tour and talked about it and said she was glad he was dead or so. They like to speculate. So right. Was there anything that she could say that
isn't true?
Go ahead, Liz.
Oh, I was going to say, which certainly isn't true. But I was going to say, just with all of this as the backdrop, I wasn't reporting this story at all, just due to my husband's position. But I was vocal in our newsroom about, well, what about this, or there's this person too. But I could just clearly tell that there was none of that in the media. We weren't considering anything beyond the racist narrative that we pushed from day one, and they seemed to be fine with it, even though you could see the division. Literally, the city is on fire for days as a result of withholding the facts. And Jay and I found things that were basically publicly available that disappeared. And there's many of those examples in the book. And we had the perfect politicians, the perfect people, the perfect places for this play out in Minnesota. And we go into a lot of those backstories with people that really are to happen.
Oh, you're freezing. Shamika wanted to say something. Go ahead, Shamika.
So I can remember when this first happened, one of the first videos that I remember seeing is someone yelling in the background, telling him to stop resisting. I have never seen that video again, ever. It was like when it first came out, and I remember him saying, you've been resisting for, I think he even named how long, the time had been. I've never seen that video again, ever.
Liz, JC?
Well, the body camera videos were not released to the public. They were withheld. That doesn't happen. That's the whole point of body cam videos, right? But there was a reason that those 4 videos were withheld for months. And even when they were available, you basically had to sign up as a reporter to go view. I think there were like that for people to go see, and then they had to narrate what they saw as reporters in the video. And even all of that was greatly reduced in what we saw in trial. So there was a reason that the full story wasn't available from the beginning. I know Jay has more to say on that.
Did you want to add anything to that? Because I have another interesting question, but go ahead and add something if you want, Jay.
Sure, real quick. To that, exactly. We actually had the media suing to be able to see the body cam video. That's the anti-Ferguson. We've learned nothing about what happened, all the accountability. When does that happen? And then the other key thing is what Liz talks about in the book, and the challenge we had, realizing the subject and realizing the truth that she was going to say. We need absolute facts. And one of the ones that we came across that Liz discovered in her research was on May 26th, approximately 7 or 8 hours after the autopsy was completed, a prosecutor meeting with the Attorney General's office, 2 other special agents from the state and the FBI, writes a memo and says, from all the videos I have seen, his knee was on the side of his neck, not where the structures are. The prosecutors knew this then. They wrote it. They put it in a memo, and Liz has brought that out and put it plain as day in her book.
And all of these autopsy results are available within about 12 hours, but they also withheld that for an entire week after part of Minneapolis burned to the ground.
Well, my next real basic question is, again, goes to the great comment Will made earlier. So while we're debating how long it was on the neck, was it on the neck? Did we hear his neck crush or whatever the case may be? We were told from day one, this was, the lynching, the murder of the Black man. It was on person. It was all racist. Whatever happened with that? Where is the evidence, 2 years after that said, because I remember at one point that the only thing I remember, because, Shamika talked about watching the video. I didn't watch it because I don't follow these individual stories because I don't really care. I know that makes me a jerk, but, we're all human. I don't really care. So I didn't watch any video, but I do remember somebody alluding to the fact that Chauvin may have known him before, right? So they were trying to imply, do you all remember that? They were implying that either it was a personal beef. On the one side, they were trying to, and on the other side, they were saying this proves that it was malicious because they knew each other, whatever. And then other people were trying to say, well, they knew each other, so obviously it couldn't have been racist. But regardless of what it was, you never heard anything else about that. But even if that's not true, no one ever said, here's the evidence of all his Klan scrawling on walls or whatever else proving that he was racist. Did the racist thing just go away? Where's that evidence?
Well, there were other officers involved, including a Hmong American officer, a Black officer that nobody wants to talk about. And Chauvin and George Floyd did not know each other. That was just another one of the many lies that were told from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. But again, the only clip of video we see is Chauvin with Floyd. We don't, and that was shown dozens of times just within the trial itself, and there was a reason for that, to just keep that narrative going for as long as possible. But
no one's ever proved that he had some. I mean, even like the Rodney King verdict, did they go back and say, okay, we can't prove that he hated George Floyd, but here is Chauvin in 2013 making a video about Black people or something. Nobody even brought that up during the trial or any of that.
No, the interesting thing about this case is what Liz said. Either 2 or 3 of the officers involved were just openly non-white. I think it's might be getting these names wrong. Thao and Kung. One guy is Hmong American. One guy is like Black and Korean. I found this out doing research for commentary 2 years ago for what became a pretty long article, Afro-Latino and Korean, I think. Mm-hmm. But Chauvin himself was in an interracial marriage. I forget offhand whether his wife was Asian or African-American. I don't think it matters, but there's very little evidence that he was a bigot. I mean, he might have been a bad cop. He'd been involved in a previous shooting. The victim was white, as I recall. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the idea that this crew of guys was a group of racists is really unfounded. It was either 3/4 or 1/2 minority group of officers. So it just, again, that was just one of those things that was kind of out there. One of the guys, I mean, I'll say again, you worry about being canceled. I'll say this frankly, you kind of have to feel sorry for. It was his 7th day on the job.
Right.
I mean, he was with 3 pretty senior officers, and he was sort of managing traffic.
Actually, it was two rookie officers. It was two rookie officers, Will Thomas Lane. Yep,
Okay.
and J. Alexander King. It was the first
White guy and a
week
black guy. Yeah. Okay.
being
So I mean,
off of the FTO
yeah,
position.
but I mean, both of them. I mean, my understanding is that they're off the force and they're going to get a couple of years. I mean, it's just those guys, including the minority cop, like everyone that was involved in that situation. And you always get in these debates when you're on Twitter or Facebook about this, like, how do you know? Are you implying that juries are influenced by what's going on in society? But I mean, mostly Caucasian jury just gave the Waukesha killer 1,000 years. Like, yes. I think that to some extent we did see every one of those guys. They're drummed off the force. They're going to prison. And you kind of know what this is. So for Chauvin, that's pretty understandable. In these other cases, I mean, no, I don't think there's any evidence that these Asian or these Latino or African American officers are bigots. I mean, that's just all part of what's gone out into the ether of the case, so that almost everyone believes it. Like almost everyone that I play basketball with thinks Kyle Rittenhouse shot 3 black guys. And that's the media effect. Like almost every brother urban white kid under 30 thinks that. You could poll on this and that's what you'd find.
Right. So I guess before I want to take a step back before we get back to George Floyd, and you being there, growing up in the area and doing the news locally every day, what was the pulse of Minneapolis like, on May 24th? Like what was it like the 6 months before leading up to that? What was crime like? What was quality of life like? What were the cultural movements around the city like before that happened?
I think it's such a great question because it's great perspective to go back, because I think so many of us have forgotten what life was like back then. And frankly, we took our safety for granted. You never in a million years heard about carjackings, record homicides. I mean, after George Floyd, we had 3 children under the age of 10 murdered within a week in Minneapolis. That has never happened in the city's history. Crime is completely out of control. We've seen this same thing play out across the country. People don't go to Twins games, to Timberwolves games, to Vikings games. That never happened before. The safety was just, a Midwestern city. We trusted one another. People respected the police, but they've left in droves as a result of this incident. And one would say that they really can't blame them, but it is completely different.
Wow. Shamika, anything you want to add?
Yes, I wanted to know, what did your company give you for the reason? Can you let the audience know why they demoted you? What was the reason they gave, or did they?
Maybe you can find out for me.
You're still waiting for that answer.
Yeah, I was never really told. I mean, at first I understood the story was, conflict of interest to stay off the story. But then I kept asking. My husband retired a few months later, and then I thought, okay, well, for sure, then I can probably have my position back. But that didn't happen, and they never really gave me a reason. It was politically clear that I needed to leave.
Were you on the anchor desk for 4 years while married to him?
Yes, I was. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't a conflict. I
was on the anchor desk, and I don't want to brag, but I had the highest ratings at the station. I had a very strong, loyal following, because you know how the local news is. That's the whole point. They want to get to know you. I've been around for 12 years. I was there for 14 years. I'm a Minnesota native. I was kind of the homegrown kid. And so viewers even
started your own newspaper
to try to get me back on the air. Thank you. You're reading the book, Charles? Yes.
Right. And then all that, and then now you have a conflict
in a second.
Right. That's crazy. So they never gave you a reason.
Exactly. And I guess my conflict of interest at the end of the day was the fact that I cared about the facts from the very beginning, just like I have every other story before. And I kind of just wouldn't go along with it. I think at the end of the day, that's what the case was.
So JC, you're the media guy. So from the media standpoint, what were they leaving out and what were they directing in so it might be like, it's not like they weren't telling the truth, but they were framing things a certain way. So Liz tries to, ask these questions, and to her credit, it was in the newsroom. So it's not like she was out on the street saying this. And what were the replies she was getting? What were the media's doing? What were they doing? The anchors doing? on camera that made you like, kind of scratch your head and say that doesn't make sense?
Yeah, well, great question there. Also, a little bit of my background too. So, managing editor, former managing editor, also former police officer, also former firefighter. So, there's some of that boots on the ground experience. But what I noticed is even in the Facebook video we all watched, as Liz pointed out, that was framed and focused, already telling a narrative by what the bystanders were saying. And then that just gets picked up. The media got trumped on that, if you will. So they're playing catch up. They're running that narrative. And then, as I mentioned, very early on, and as Liz points out in the book, we had prosecutors, we had politicians coming out saying one thing, realizing their assumptions are now very wrong. And instead of telling the truth, and instead of giving the mea culpas, and instead of salvaging that in some way for the sake of civility, as Liz points out, they just kept going with the lies and the scapegoating. Mm-hmm. And then it had to be this and nothing else. The strangest fact about this, if you will, is the officer who had the most contact with George Floyd is Black. The officer who also was with George Floyd the first 3 times he said, "I can't breathe," was also Black. And those facts are not reported. So as Liz talks about in the book, there are so many lies by omission. I couldn't even begin to bring them up, but they are doing that to support the narrative, to support that type of scapegoating that became politically necessary. And also for the media to save themselves from themselves and their own assumptions.
Mm-hmm. So to the police.
Talk about this in the book too, Charles. Just this is a mandate that the station I work for put in place. But after George Floyd, we were told that we could only interview people. 50% of the people we interviewed had to be of a protected class. That was a mandate that was put in place for the news.
Are all the classes protected? What are these protected classes? Doesn't the Constitution protect all the classes?
And we also. It was so strange. I'm like, I have to go to the scene of a fire and ask, who you're sleeping with. Like I couldn't even wrap my head around how this is supposed to.
What happens if you go to the scene of fire and there are only white men who are straight? Do you just ignore the fire and keep going?
There were a lot of things that I don't think we could really wrap our head around. But again, it was just another example of kind of this media manipulation and this propaganda that played out from day one.
So what I was going to ask about the police is, what is their take on it? Like, obviously you all know people and talk to them. So initially, what were they thinking as they saw it unfold? Did they think that the cops did the bad thing, and they just like, we're not going to say anything, but they don't like it? Not saying that they think they murdered him, went to jail, but were they like, I wouldn't have done that? Were they 100% behind him? Was there friction within the department? And then as the things started to smolder and things started to burn, like I'd love to know if you talked to any of the people in the police station they burned to the ground, what they had to say.
That we did. Yeah, it's really interesting and frankly just heartbreaking to hear about what happened there with surrender. I mean, it was a planned surrender of the third. City leaders decided to kind of give some sort of preparation to the protesters. But just back to your other question, Charles, I'll just talk about from my husband's perspective. I think that the unions, this is a board of 10 people, they thought, okay, well, the facts will come out. And they've never seen something like this where we have a training manual that disappears offline, and all we hear about are chokeholds and neck restraints, which isn't even a part of what went on.
What happened?
I think they were thinking, okay, this is going to be cleared up. And as the days passed, they kind of saw the writing on the wall that the administration cares more about politics and optics than their people. So I think that was kind of I guess a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking, if you will, of I would have done this or should have, would have, could have. But I think in the end that they witnessed sort of their police chief push this narrative right alongside the mayor of Minneapolis from the very beginning.
That's interesting to hear. Will, anything you want to add?
Yeah, that actually was one of the questions that I was going to ask that you kind of beat me to, like, what did the cops think about this? Because I think that the almost universal presentation of the George Floyd case, so there are kind of two takes on it. Like the leftist take is, like the conventional mainstream leftist take is, this is an evil murder committed by a racist that reflects the massive problem of racist police murder. And the conservative take seems to be, well, this is extremely bad policing, but we don't have a problem with racist police murder overall. But almost everyone refers to George Floyd as being murdered, so on down the line. Mm-hmm. And when my friends are about 50-50 on this. I mean, I know a lot of lawyers and a lot of ex-cops who will say, I mean, there's a duty to understand sort of the eggshell plaintiff rule. So if you're interacting with someone who's visibly on drugs, like Floyd was, and they start saying things like, I can't breathe, or I'm going to die, you probably should consider modifying, the hold they're in or the position they're in. So I do think that is a valid point. But what I'm getting to with this is that there seems to be pretty obviously a third perspective here, which is that the Minnesota Police Department's manual of operations or manual of procedure, whatever, has reappeared. And what Derek Chauvin did, what all the officers on the scene did, looks to me, although I'm not a cop, pretty much like what they had been trained to do. So I guess forbidden cancelable position 3 would be, these cops, whether or not perfectly, were in a heat of the moment situation. They did what they trained to do. You aren't going to encounter too many situations like this. And there was a lot going on. I mean, you had a hostile crowd that prevented paramedics from getting through, so on. And while you were interacting with this very intoxicated person, the combination of, the restraint, drugs, so on, caused what was basically a heart attack. If you read through the report, coronary pulmonary trauma, whatever the technical term is, and the guy died. So none of the other officers, and arguably not Chauvin, should have been convicted of certainly murder. You could argue any charges in the case. So that's the position that the other half of the policemen and lawyers that I know, or more than that, have. Mm-hmm. And that's a position that you almost never see in mainstream media, in mainstream society. I just did this really awkward sort of halting way of presenting it, which isn't usual for me, because there's the idea of this is so evil, this is so over the line. But again, I don't know if I'm adding anything to what Charles said, but I do think that's a valid question. So Liz, you're saying that that's exactly what a lot of cops thought, like, perfect or not, this was in the manual and the union's going to stand up for us, so on. And then people were just shocked to see that not happen. Like whether or not they were in the right, people were shocked.
The manual went offline. It disappeared. The police chief on the stand said, this isn't a part training. That was a lie. The head of the training said this is a part of training. that was a lie. I've been doing some of these book talks, and a lot of people actually, you can hear them gasp when you show the side by side of the manual to what this MRT, this maximum restraint technique that the officers were doing. But I think you bring up some great points, Will, but absolutely, we were not putting that was not going to be on TV. It's not going to be any sort of TV story, and still won't be. I mean, it won't be.
Yeah, no, that's the thing also. I mean, and this gets into the point of kind of fair coverage of issues, I think. So again, like you would expect the prosecutor in this case to argue against the best lawyer the police union could retain or whatever. But the point is they're both supposed to be in court kicking ass. And it's a little weird, like when you say something like, I wasn't aware of this, I will tell you, if you're familiar with Reddit and so on down the line, the police manual has reappeared. I'm sure some officer was disgusted by this and put that back in the public square. But the idea that
it's in the book, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty, there are a lot of people that are aware of this, whether or not most of them are publicly identified online by their names. I mean, there are a fair number of people that are aware of this by now. But I guess the one sentence point here is, yeah, I think a lot of people would be shocked to hear that is the case, that this is something that was in fact defensible. And I'm pretty sure, yes, a lot of officers in Minneapolis felt like a lot of officers in Chicago and Louisville did, they were bamboozled by the department's reaction. That's pretty much the point there.
JC, former cop, you want to add to that?
Yeah, as Liz points out, very much in policy. The testimony from the chief, from the head of training at the time, absolutely wild, utter fabrication, and as Liz says in the book, lies by omission. And she even points out the policy right there, clear as day, what they were doing to the T. So if you look at Derek Chauvin and all the officers involved, for the most part, they are not your gung-ho alpha male type police officers. They're not skull breakers or bone breakers, as we might say. These are more of your Boy Scouts by the book club of officers. So what I gather is, and even as Liz has interviewed his mother, very much by the book, following policy type guy. Even she is aware of what the policy says, as Liz points out, and they follow it to a T. Yet the chief, everyone else, acts as if that's not even a policy, and they go on carrying on about chokeholds and neck restraints and all this other stuff that is clearly not the MRT technique, maximum restraint technique, that they were trying to apply. And even more to that, as Liz points out, they were actually de-escalating. In other words, the full technique is you put someone on the ground in that position, the way they were, and then you use something called a hobble, which is to restrain their legs so someone can't kick you or get up and run, which could happen, especially when they suspected someone on stimulants, right? They didn't do that. They backed off when they noticed his condition was going in a different direction. That is absolute the antithesis of intentional murder. That is de-escalation and following a technique and following procedure. So much like what we were just talking about, yeah, there's this 50-50 camp, but there was so much of the reaction to the bamboozlement, if you will. Yeah. People just didn't know what to make of it. But as Liz points out, there are clear and very succinct absolute facts in this case. They just need to be made known.
Yeah.
Liz, I want to briefly talk about your husband. You say, you know, you were demoted, virtually forced out. You had these threats and all these kind of things because he was the president of the police union at the time. So talk about some of the things he went through, some of the aggression from people and, you know, threats and things of that nature, and what was being said and done to him, you know, as the president of the police union.
Well, yes. So Bob Kroll is his name. Unfortunately, he had
we're kind of losing you, Liz.
Oh, you can't hear me?
Now we can.
I was just saying that it starts with a K, and he became Bob KK Kroll. So that was disgusting. And they protested at his union, and they protested at the television station where I worked too before they found where we lived. They came for a few different protests. One that received some attention involved a state rep. It was a BLM sponsored protest, but a state rep who beat me in pinata effigy in the driveway. They made pinatas out of both Bob and I, dressed as Klansmen, and shouted at all of our neighbors. There were about maybe more than 100 protesters there. So, and demanding that we lose our jobs. And thankfully we weren't home, but our neighbors basically lived that hell that summer, when people would just randomly show up. And because this is now a country where you just show people's, you know, front doors to do this. And they wrote all kinds of horrible messages in sidewalk chalk in the street, you know, basically hoping that we were killed. And somebody sent a bomb threat to our home. It just kind of was completely insane for a few months.
And keep in mind, people, that this is just, yeah, I'm going to you in a minute, Shamika, but this is because he just said, let's wait and see what the fact says. That was his egregious thing. And then I want to, point of clarification, because I got to clean up for Will and Shamika saying all this stuff that might get us canceled and get on the good side. When they beat you in the piano and dressed you up as Klan people, you would have been the Klan's woman. I don't want you to misgender your Klan role. So
okay.
Klan's woman. Shamika, I have a question.
My husband was wearing a diaper in the pinata, so yes.
To be fair, Klansman is a generic. It's
right,
like,
I know, but I just want to, try to get the
countries
people
and
happy.
warships and
right. Shamika, I have a question for you, but you were going to ask something first, and I would like to allow you to do that before I ask you.
Yeah, I was just listening to Liz talk and thinking I had never even heard of her or her story until Candace's documentary. And you would think that something happening on this scale would have been in the media, and it's just crazy to me that they buried this and acted like this wasn't happening. I was shocked that there was actually someone who was a reporter, who was with an ex-police or, retired police officer that was kind of in the midst or the middle of all of this, because I had never heard it before. And just listening to JC earlier, I have a friend who's a former police officer that initially kept saying he was talking about Chauvin. He was following protocol. He's not going to be found guilty. And we were all shocked because I thought they knew what they were talking about as a former police officer. And then for it to come back that no, he was guilty and no one ever said, well, this was the protocol. It was like, okay, the media is covering this up and somebody's lying.
All right, so I had a question in mind, but Shamika just said something. I told you, Liz, how sometimes the conversation goes away. So Shamika said she talked to a police officer who saw this, and he said, well, that's protocol, which I can buy. And then he said, there's no way he's going to get found guilty. Okay, back up. You know what instantly popped in my mind? You all might find this funny. It took me back to the end of 2020 after the election. So all the MAGA people were like, look at all this. There's these irregularities. And all my friends were calling me. And they were like, oh, look at this. Look at what's happening in Arizona. Look at what's happening in Georgia. Look at what happened in Philadelphia. There's stuff on camera. This whole, whatever Mules movie stuff before it happened, right? So they were saying, oh, this is going to be turned over. No, but here's my point, Will. Whether that's true or not, let's assume it. This is what I laughed about. I told them, let's assume everything is true. They catch everybody. Biden himself is on video stuffing ballots. You think with people in the street, after they just burned down half the country, that any one of these Supreme Court justices would have enough balls to flip over this election, even if it's true? I'm not arguing that it's true. People don't say he's a conspiracy. I'm saying even if I could prove it was happening, it wasn't going to happen. So that's what I thought of. It's like, I don't care how innocent this guy is. They just burned a third of the country like Sherman burning his way to the shore. They are not going to let this guy go home.
General Sherman, Black hero. One thing to ride on Charles' point for a second there, though, I don't think, JC, I think you're a cop by background. Those of us that have legal experience on are aware of how crazy this is. But the idea of someone being convicted of manslaughter, like murder 1 or murder 2, and then a secondary count of murder, that is extraordinarily unusual is the politest way I can think of to put that. So when you talk about that, and at least like the Waukesha guy getting sentenced to 1,000 years, like that happens. They're just, excuse the language, like, fuck you. Like, we can't kill you. So we're just going to do this. We're going to sentence you to life 10 times. Right. So juries frequently make statements that go right to the boundary of the law, if not beyond it. This was a pretty clear example of that. So when people say, this is something like when people say, well, a jury decided their guilt. Like a jury decided that the guys in the Rodney King beating were completely innocent. A jury decided OJ was innocent. That doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with the logical facts in the case. Oh, Charles is a slightly older traditional Black man. Are you going to say OJ was innocent? Just
I'm kidding.
Flip the script.
No, he killed a bunch of people. I was just kidding.
Yeah, well, he only killed 2 people, allegedly. Attorney ad-libs there.
Right,
no,
right,
I do think
found guilty by a jury of his peers.
Yeah, found innocent. Well, but again, you're as we all know, you're found not guilty.
Right.
But and even here, Chauvin was found guilty until appeal and so on, and all this really is important. But the idea of being found guilty of murder, manslaughter, and homicide or something like that, that's obviously a statement being made. You can question whether it's a correct one, to play devil's advocate, but clearly, like, Maxine Waters flew into Minneapolis, one of you might correct me, but the day before this verdict issued, and said, well, we're not going to be content with a manslaughter verdict, to a crowd holding weapons. So, I mean, when you talk about that kind of lynch mob scenario, I mean, now we are in a more diverse place because a person of any race can do it these days. But I mean, that is almost the traditional picture, like a politician known for their radical base speaks to that base outside a courthouse while they have arms and a rope. I mean, it's not ideal, let's say.
I don't know who to go to. I did not forget my question for Shamika, but if Liz or JC want to reply to any of Will or my foolishness, I was just kidding. But still, if you want to reply, I mean, I was kidding, but still, it really is a thing, Shamika. There was no way they weren't going to be found guilty. It just was no way it was happening.
Yeah, this was kind of early on, you know.
Wow.
I don't even know. I mean, it was just, we did not think it was going to take that turn because, I mean, I guess she, you know, thought this, I'm a police. I'm a former police. This is protocol. And then things just start going downhill.
Right. But what I wanted to say to you, what I was going to go to you first, and then obviously let the others comment, because I figured you might have some interesting commentary on this. So Liz was talking about what she and her husband went through because he was a former cop and the president of the police union. And, you know, ever since you gave me a hard time for being homeless, I'm starting to be more like you, where I just come out and say what I got to say. So I'm not really a big fan of police unions because I'm not a public union fan. Apologize, former cop. But I am a fan of consistency. So Shamika, I'll start with you. I find it interesting that all these people hate police and hate police unions, but they love teachers unions, right? So like, I can't believe they defend these police, even though in this case, police chief went the other way. He ran away from everything and said they're guilty. But you get these situations where a cop does something shooting and they're like, I can't believe the union is going to get behind these people. It's a wall of racism. But then they get behind pedophile teachers who fight for them to get their pictures because that's their job. So Shamika, I want to start with you. What are your thoughts about this, weird view, if not full-on hypocrisy of we hate the police union from the group of pro-union people, right? So they're like teachers unions, they like all the other unions, private sector or public, which there's a difference between the two, but they seem to hate police for doing the exact same thing for their members that the teachers unions are doing for their members. What's the difference?
I don't think we can make sense of this, Charles. You're talking about the side that can't even define what a woman is. So to think that they can actually have some type of logic behind their reasoning is just, we can't, they don't.
JC, Liz?
Yeah, I was just going to say with the union itself, even, this is in the book too, about Bob's crazy, wild statement where he just asked for, due process and calm, and that as the union, they would support the officers and other unions, yes, including the teachers union. Then they turned around and they asked for Bob to resign, and he's a racist. How dare he support a mixed race group of officers? It was just completely insane. Right. But I think Shamika is absolutely right. You can't really make sense of
how dare he call for order when we're trying to burn the city down. Get out of the way. Yeah. Wow, that's crazy. JC, you have anything you want to say?
I was just going to point out that so Liz unfortunately had to live this experience, and it's still going on. But if you can imagine for a moment working with Liz, and I was always expecting, okay, so when are you going to give me the upshot? When are you going to tell me the real story here? Mm-hmm. And it was always like, well, no, Bob wrote 8 sentences. Okay, how bad were they? Well, no, they're not. I'm like, okay, Liz, you don't have to sugarcoat it. How bad were they? And then she shows me what he wrote, and Bob takes great notes too. Liz is an excellent note taker, and I read this thing, exactly what he wrote, and it's, now is not the time to rush to judgment, ask for calm, civility, and we'll support our officers. And like Shamika was pointing out, then the world goes crazy and loses their already crazy minds, mm-hmm, and attacks him for, like you just mentioned, advocating civility while we're trying to burn everything down. How dare he? That was difficult. I don't know how many times, and poor Liz had to deal with me saying, okay, so this can't be true. Why don't you tell me the real story? And the facts laid bare, very simple. It was challenging for me just to deal with the prima facie, here's the facts in front of you, and that's it. There are the facts, there's the story. So really bizarre trying to deal with that lack of reasoning, lack of logic, lack of anything civil, and then trying to tell this story in the middle of all that, in that context, was one of the most challenging things I've had to do to date.
Liz, have they learned anything from this? I mean, I know I'm asking a sarcastic, rhetorical question because I just saw Keith Ellison on the news recently, a clip. So I know they haven't, but I'm gonna pretend I didn't. So have they learned anything from this? Have they grown? At least the one silver lining we can get from this is that the politicians and the people in the community who were carrying torches have now, gained a larger sense of clarity, and they understood that they were wrong, and they realized that the police need their support and all that kind of thing. Went back against to defund the police. Have they learned everything? Things going to be, is everyone singing Kumbaya in Minneapolis now?
Well, I know you're going to be shocked, Charles, but it's an election year. So now Keith Ellison, he's all along, he's never even called for the defunding of the police. That's what he says. That. And all along, Governor Walz has always supported the police. It is absolutely remarkable, the turnaround that has happened 6 months prior to the election. We are being pictured with police officers constantly on social media, and he has supported them. This is the governor that waited 4 days to call in the National Guard after block of Minneapolis was set ablaze. So I'd like to say yes. We also can't forget that they were trying to oust Trump at any cost back in 2020, and I know sure well that the George Floyd incident was kind of the perfect storm for that campaign season as well. So.
Do you all still have that mayor that went and kissed everybody's feet and bowed down and said you can have whatever until they said we don't want you here, go away, and he ran away? Is he still there?
Mayor Jacob Fry, he is still here.
He's still the mayor.
Still the mayor of Minneapolis.
You remember that, Shamika? Well, he was like, "Well, I stand with you all, and I would give you whatever you want. What do you want? I would give you anything you want." He was carrying like gold bullions. He had stuff drenched on. I give you whatever you want. They said, "We want you to leave." Like, excuse me, what now? We want you to get out. Okay, so he just turned around, put his tail between his legs, and walked away. That was amazing. That was so awesome. And he's still the mayor. Wow.
And reelected.
Oh, of course. I mean, why not? I mean,
he was reelected.
Why not? I mean, Newsom was reelected. I mean, so many others. Why not? Will, anything else you want to cover Minneapolis wise or country going to hell?
I would actually go into kind of two short, broader points that I get from Liz and from this conversation tonight, because I think this gets into some narratives that we see over and over. First of all, kind of the official approved regime narrative, especially in kind of that very dominant center left, is almost never true. I've been in that same position that JC was just in when I was writing Hate Crime Hoax. And I was, not to plug my own work, but I mean, when I was looking through these stories, it was like, oh, Jussie Smollett, not true. Covington Catholic, not true. Yasmin Saweed, not true. Race Crazy is a great book too, by the way. Read it, reviewed it. Excellent piece of work. But I mean, just on and on down the line. Duke Lacrosse, not true. Tawana Brawley, not true. There are 800 of them in the data set now. So these stories very, very often are fictional, and you can go beyond each individual case that JC, Liz, you guys have done a great job of breaking down, me and Charles have looked at, to whole storylines like Black Lives Matter, where Chernobyl went on primetime Fox and claimed that every day an unarmed Black man is direct quote murdered by the police. Total number of unarmed brothers killed by the cops last year is 18. So, I mean, it very, very often is the case that when real quants, serious people from the media, business, academia start looking at the stuff, it's just crap. That's part one. Part two is, and then it never happened. This is where the 1984 really comes in. The day after you expose it, it never happened. No one ever recommended the COVID vaccine for kids. No one ever favored defunding the police. You see these people that were marching to the barricades like squad members, like Cori Bush posing with cops. It's just the wildest stuff in the game. And like the right can do this too, but it's rarely quite as blatant because the basic ideas like maybe we should cut taxes for rich people are rarely quite as stupid. So, I mean, it's just keep that in mind. The narrative's very often false. And I should say, by the way, the bad ideas on the right. There are many good ones too, like let parents determine what their kids see in school and so on. But I mean, narrative very often wrong. And when it's wrong, the next day it goes away and we were never at war with East Asia. So keep an eye out for that kind of blatant gaslighting. I wouldn't be surprised, by the way, if maybe not Shelvin, last line from me, but some of these cops appeal in a couple of years or a year, they get free. This is all wiped away. And then people a couple of years from now are Bill Mahering it and saying, well, we always knew there were some flaws in this case, like they're already doing with Jacob Blake and so on down the line. And the actual brave first journalists, academics, Liz and so on that broke this story years ago are going to have to, fight the parvenus not to be ignored. That, I'm calling it right now, is what's going to happen. We saw this with Trayvon Martin a couple of years ago, by the way. We covered that on this show.
3 quick points. One, this is why this podcast is so tremendous. It's not because of me. It's because Shamika's a star and Will is brilliant. Watch for that. Number two. One of the points. The one time I love it when I can be like, hey, and I can get a little shine when I'm on the stage with these two. And I remember it like it was yesterday. Will is on the radio show and we're talking about Jacob Blake, and I said, Will, how many times was Jacob shot? And to this day, was it 2 years later, you still Google it. They did it on the media. Here's one for you, Liz. I don't know how they covered it there. To this day, look it up, ladies and gentlemen. They say Jacob Blake was shot 7 times. He was not. That is a lie. He was not shot 7 times. And they still, to this day, people still talk about, that's why when they shot that man 7 times. They did not shoot him 7 times. They shot at him 7 times. He was not shot 7 times. And lastly, everything Will said was correct and brilliant, and a lot of hoaxes. His books is great, as is Race Crazy. But I just want to add, except for Bubba. My man Bubba didn't lie. That was really in news. I kid. Anyone else want to comment on Will's important points that tend to repeat itself over and over again? Liz, JC? Liz, go.
I think they're great. I really hope with the election coming up just days away. As I said, we're all paying the price for what happened in Minneapolis, and we can do better, and people deserve to be safe. And we need to support brave men and women who sign up to do this. And I think that's why Jay and I wanted to do this book too. It's a lot of these untold stories about these people who were forced from this profession that they lived for. These are good cops that left because of they had no support, and everybody went along with the lies.
JC, I got one last question to you, and then if you want to make a final comment, you can. But Liz made a point that maybe that at some point, we'll get beyond this. When will we get beyond this? Because I just see more, murder, violence, and more people getting out of jail for being violent.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. I don't mean to be the pessimistic optimist or the reverse of that, but it's going to take a lot, as Liz points out, a lot more skepticism. We need that to come back. We need people to be honest with themselves and others and say, I don't think that sounds right. They need to question the narrative and ask the questions we should have been asking all along, as Liz says. And then, as we pointed out in the last part of the discussion, we need the civility back. We need more than just the demands of where's the accountability or the lack of it. We need to be able to make a mistake and have some context between us, some type of humanity to make sense of it all. I don't see that coming back with all the polarity that we have in this two-party system going on in the so-called United States of America. And unfortunately, we're lacking a lot of the media literacy to even look at something like we had presented to us and say, wait a minute, I don't think that's true, without someone being canceled or violated or worse, like Liz and Bob were. And I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to speak with all of you and also your audience. Thank you.
Shamika, any final words from you?
Well, I guess my final word would be to Will. I would like an autographed copy of your book and telling me how wonderful I am.
You don't already have an autographed copy of his book?
No.
I'll DM you right now.
See, he's gonna put this autographed book in the DM somehow. Okay.
Sliding in those DMs. The technique.
Well, this has been a great conversation, and thank you for enlightening us, giving us a little backstory on what was happening there on the ground in Minneapolis. And, you know, your story, Liz, she is Liz Collin, former Emmy Award winning, correct?
Yeah, I'm with Alpha News now. I found a job. So
yes,
yeah,
but you're
check
award
out
winning.
alphanews.org is a good place to go to.
Yes, former award winning reporter, and JC Shea, her editor. The book is Their Line, The Media, the Left, and the Death of George Floyd. Thank you for joining us, and talk to you all next week.
Patriot J, I'm saving the day. Patriot J, I'm saving the day from you commies who let know you can't fuck with me. I got a country to save. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and the home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save because I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.